Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Ko. I'm an assistant professor at PSI department, and I'm also in charge of the Korean Studies Center. So before I present you to today's guest speaker, let me quickly introduce this lecture series and Korean Studies Center, because many of you do not know that we have research center dedicated to Korea and Korean affairs within SSH. So just a quick introduction about the series. Well, the series is about introducing social and public policies of South Korea, which is supported by the Korea Foundation. Using the support, some research grant, we invite several scholars from South Korea to introduce policies across different issues and different topics. So we have scheduled 5 to 6 maximum special lecture series in this semester and until the next January. So today we have second lecture of the series, which is about the gender politics and gender-related policies in South Korea. Today's guest speaker is Dr. Yu. She's from Korea Institute of Criminology and Justice in Seoul, South Korea. And she specializes criminology in justice and law and sciences. And she received her degree from Virginia Polytech Institute and State University in the United States. And she also has numerous publications about traditional justice and the criminology and criminal justice and so on. So today she will present, as you can see the title on the screen, present a gender-based violence and the policies and the women's movement in South Korea. And I believe this might be very, very interesting topic for many of you, given some situations in Pakistan. So without further ado, I will give microphone to our guest speaker, and after her presentation, we will have a Q&A session. So feel free to ask your questions after the presentation. Okay?
Thank you for having me and for the kind introduction. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. So in today's talk, I'm going to talk about key changes in South Korea's policies on gender-based violence from the 1990s to the present, and what these changes mean for gender equality. So to start, let's go back to 1953. So 1953 was the year when South Korea enacted its criminal law, just shortly after gaining independence from Japan. So at the time, criminal code stated that anyone who rapes a woman by means of violence or intimidation shall be punished by imprisonment for at least 3 years. And this provision was placed under the title of Crimes Against Chastity. And then in 2018, we see a completely different approach with the Framework Act on the prevention of violence against women. So this law defines violence against women as gender-based violence that infringes on the right to physical and mental well-being and safety. And this includes domestic violence, sexual violence, sex trafficking, etc., etc. So as you can see, there's and also this law adopts the definition as stated in the 1993 United Nations Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women. So as you can see, there's a clear shift in perspective from chastity to a broader protection of women's rights. So in this talk, we are going to look at how this transition happened and discuss some of the current issues in South Korea. So let's now take a look at key laws addressing gender-based violence in South Korea. So as you can see, there are quite a few laws, and many of them have been revised multiple times, which means that there have been continued changes in policy. So I want to highlight a few points from this timeline. So first off, if you look at when these laws were enacted, there was a long gap after the Criminal Code of 1953. So it wasn't until 1994 that we see legislation specifically addressing gender-based violence. So, and this was driven by the rise of the women's movement in the 1980s and 90s. And second, so the focus of legislation has changed over time. So in the 1990s, the emphasis was on domestic violence and sexual violence. By the 2000s, the issues like child protection and sex trafficking and managing sex offenders were captured attention. And then in 2000s, from the 2000s and more recently, there have been laws that have been passed on addressing a broader range of gender-based violence, including stalking. So this shows how policy priorities have evolved, expanding the legal system to cover behaviors that are now previously recognized as crimes. And third, laws addressing gender-based violence are scattered across multiple pieces of legislation. So other types of crimes are typically covered under a single law, like the Criminal Code, but in terms of gender-based violence, different laws have been implemented targeting specific issues, and there are separate laws for punishing offenders and for protecting victims. So I'll explain in more detail how and why the legal system has developed in this way. So in the 1980s, the women in the 1980s. So in 1980s, the movement to eliminate violence against women began to emerge in South Korea. So back then, many women in South Korea were frequently exposed to various forms of violence. But it was not recognized as a major social issue, and there were no specific laws or policies to address it. So, for example, domestic violence. The concept of domestic violence was almost unheard of in Korean society back then. And there was a widespread belief, old belief, that if a husband beat his wife, she must have done something to deserve it, something like that. So domestic violence was largely seen as a private matter or family issue, and public intervention was considered inappropriate. But things started to change in the early 1980s when the Korea Women's Hotline was founded. So this is a non-profit organization for women's rights advocacy. And they were the first organization in Korea to provide a hotline for domestic violence victims. So, and they conducted the country's first survey on domestic violence in 1983, and the results were alarming, as you can see here. So more than 4 out of 10 married women in Seoul reported having been beaten by their husbands after marriage, and 14% reported experiencing domestic violence in the previous year alone. So with these results, the Korea Women's Hotline launched campaigns to raise public awareness about domestic violence. And they also provided public support services for victims, such as counseling, medical assistance, or legal advice, and emergency shelters. So this shows their early activities, counseling with the phone. So in their efforts, as mentioned in their founding statement, the Korea Women's Hotline emphasized that domestic violence was not just a personal or private issue, but stemmed from a patriarchal social structure and gender inequality. So this marked the beginning of the movement to change public perception and policy on violence against women. And let's move on to the 1990s. So the movements, the efforts to raise public awareness about domestic violence began in the early 1980s. And these efforts developed into legislative efforts in the early 1990s. So in the early 1990s, several severe domestic cases occurred and were brought to the attention of women's organizations. So some of the cases involved women who, after enduring years of severe domestic violence, ended up killing their husbands in self-defense. And other cases involved sons killing their abusive fathers. And also some families of women murdered by their husbands turned to women's organizations for help. So despite these severe domestic violence cases, back then the government's intervention in domestic violence cases was very limited, and criminal justice institutions were often reluctant to intervene in what was seen as family matters. So women's organizations criticized vehemently the government's inaction and called for more proactive intervention. So, okay, let me go back to this issue. So in the 1990s, this period was shortly after the end of the military regime, and various social movements began to emerge, addressing issues like disability rights, sexual identities, and environmental concerns. So the women's rights activism also gained significant momentum in this period, and those women's organizations established in the 1980s and early 90s grew rapidly during this period. And in the 1990s, the women's movement focused mainly on advocating for legislation in three areas: domestic violence, sexual violence, and sexual harassment. So their efforts were successful, leading to the enactment of related laws in the 1990s, which laid the foundation for today's policies. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on domestic violence and sexual violence. So as these were the most prominent issues during this period. Okay, again, domestic violence. So as I previously mentioned, women's organizations criticized the government's inaction, and in 1994, the Korea Women's Hotline launched a campaign for legislation against domestic violence, and they worked closely with other women's organizations to prepare a draft law, and they also submitted a petition to the National Assembly with support from thousands of citizens. So their efforts led to the enactment of two separate laws in 1997. So the first one is the Act on Special Cases Concerning the Punishment of Crimes of Domestic Violence. And this law focused on the legal proceeding of domestic violence cases. And this law recognized that domestic violence had unique features that required special criminal procedures. So the key provisions included obligations of reporting. So anyone, particularly social workers or medical practitioners or school teachers, are required to report immediately to law enforcement if they become aware of domestic violence. And other provisions included requiring the police to take immediate action, such as stopping the violence on the spot or escorting victims to medical facilities or safe locations, and allowing courts to issue restraining orders to remove the perpetrator from the household. And the second law centered on victim protection. So this law mandated that the government create a reporting system and establish shelters and support centers for victims to provide them with medical and legal assistance. So the enactment of these laws marked a turning point in addressing domestic violence in South Korea, but it didn't solve the issue overnight, of course. So So a number of challenges and setbacks persisted, and the problems remain even today. So I'm going to talk about it in more detail later. Now, let's move on to the issue of sexual violence. So in the early 1990s, two major incidents occurred and triggered the movement against sexual violence. The first one involved a woman who had been sexually assaulted as a child, later killed the abuser as an adult. And the second case involved a college student who killed her stepfather after years of sexual abuse. Then both women were charged with murder. And women's organizations rallied to provide them with legal support. And also, in response to these cases, women's organizations formed a coalition to push for legislation addressing sexual violence. So, and many women's groups actively engaged in the legislative campaign, challenging the male-centered understanding of sexual violence. So, until the early 1990s, South Korea's legal approach to sexual violence was highly problematic. So, the criminal code aimed to protect a woman's chastity rather than her right to sexual autonomy. And this legal attitude was shaped by what is called rape myths. So, particularly two issues were criticized. So the first issue was that courts often viewed rape victims with distrust or suspicion. So, for example, one infamous court ruling stated that law protects chastity only when it is worthy of protection. So what this means is that if a victim didn't fit the ideal image of innocent or chaste woman, she often faced victim blaming, like being told that she invited the rape. So as a result, a high proportion of rape cases were not reported or failed to be recognized as crime of rape in court. And the second issue was that there was a widespread belief that rape victims should resist with all her might to stop the rape. So this assumption is deeply flawed, but was widely accepted in the legal system. So, for example, in rape cases, the court required the use of force or evidence of severe physical assault or intimidation strong enough to overpower the victim's resistance. And if a victim did not resist strongly, it was often interpreted as implied consent to sexual intercourse. Yeah, it's gross. This legal approach often failed to protect rape victims who could not or chose not to resist for various reasons. So, for example, some women might stop resisting to avoid further physical harm, and others might hesitate to ask for help due to the fear of social stigma or prejudice against rape survivors. So, but in such cases, courts often found that the incident was not a crime of rape simply because the victim did not resist strong enough. So, starting in the 1990s, women's organizations actively challenged these legal attitudes and called for legal reform to better reflect the realities facing women. So their efforts were quite successful, leading to the enactment of the Act on the Punishment of Sexual Crimes and the Protection of Victims in 1994. And later in 2010, this law was split into two separate laws for the punishment of sexual crimes and victims' protection. So these laws brought in some important changes. First of all, penalties for sex offenses were increased, especially for the offenses involving vulnerable victims, like people with disabilities or children under 18 or those victimized by family members. And various types of behaviors were made illegal. New types of behaviors were criminalized. For example, indecent acts or unwanted physical contact in public spaces, such as on public transport, were criminalized. And later, a series of amendments have been made to criminalize the production and distribution of sexual contents without consent. And also, these laws improved victim protection and support, particularly during investigations and trials in the legal system. And also, the outdated concept of chastity was removed from legal language, finally. So in 1995, the Criminal Code was revised to replace the term crimes against chastity with crimes of rape and indecent acts. Also, court rulings gradually started to treat rape as a violation of the right to sexual autonomy or the right to make decisions about their own body. So these legislative efforts by women's organizations had mostly wrapped up by the late 1990s. But during this time, a new wave of activism against sexual violence emerged on university campuses. So this movement was driven by the rise of young feminists. And by this time, by like 2000, the number of female students in university had significantly increased. And following the democratization of South Korea in 1987, universities became more open to discussions about sexuality and gender issues. So these changes together contributed to the emergence of a radical anti-sexual violence movement on university campuses. So in 1997, student organizations across universities came together to form the Women's Solidarity to Eradicate Campus Sexual Violence and Promote Women's Rights. So their primary goal was to push university authorities to establish regulations addressing sexual violence and harassment. So at the time, universities had no formal reporting system for sexual violence among students or staff. So if a student experienced sexual violence, their only option was to report to the police. But as we have seen, this often led to lengthy criminal procedures with little chance of holding the perpetrator accountable. So as a result, despite the high prevalence of sexual violence in campuses, most incidents went unreported and remained hidden. So against this backdrop, student activists sought to expose the widespread nature of sexual violence in campuses, calling for cultural change within academic institutions. So female students began to engage in consciousness-raising activities, sharing their experiences, and publicly speaking out about sexual violence. So one of the most powerful and controversial strategies these students used was the public exposure of perpetrators' identities, so who committed the sexual violence like that. So they did this through posters, as you can see here in the photos, and public statements, and sometimes online, which is similar to the later #MeToo movement. So this approach provoked intense debates. So some critics argue that it violated the rights of the accused, something like that. But however, students chose to expose the incidents and perpetrators due to the absence of institutional procedures at universities and limited access to criminal justice. So under these circumstances, victims and their supporters sought to address the issue by making the incidents public and demanding apologies from perpetrators. So basically, feminist students used this tactic to convey the message that sexual violence was a pervasive problem that the entire community should face and deal with. So with these efforts, students made sexual violence a main agenda on campuses, which led to institutional changes. So universities started to adopt regulations on addressing sexual violence and harassment. And they established counseling centers for victims and implemented procedures for protecting victims and holding perpetrators accountable. Okay, so let's briefly look at the policy changes from the mid-2000s to the early 2010s. This period is marked with the introduction of strengthened laws for managing sex offenders. But these laws were often more a reaction to public outrage rather than the result of concerted efforts of the women's movement. So during this period, media coverage for sexual crimes surged, and especially a series of high-profile sexual crimes against children and adolescents captured media attention. So one such case was a middle school gang rape case in 2004, where 44 teenagers were involved as perpetrators, but most of them didn't get punished because they were minors. And a few more sexual crime cases against elementary school children followed. And in one of these cases, the perpetrator was a repeat sex offender with 9 prior convictions. And in another case, the court handed down a lenient sentence because the offender was found drunk at the time of the crime. So these cases provoked intense public outcry over the failure of the criminal justice system. And this led to a series of legal reforms. So penalties for sexual crimes were increased, particularly those for offenses involving victims under the age of 13. And new measures were introduced to manage sex offenders, such as electronic monitoring with GPS tracking ankle bracelets, as you can see in the picture, and chemical treatments to reduce sexual impulses, which is often known as chemical castration. So the photo below is the electronic monitoring center. So now South Korea has one of the most comprehensive and stringent systems for managing sex offenders in the world. But, however, women's organizations had ambivalent attitudes toward these developments because, on the one hand, they welcomed the government's tougher stance on sexual violence, but on the other hand, they raised concerns that this emphasis on punishing offenders might overshadow the need for victim support. So often, public opinion equates strict punishment with victim protection, but in reality, the situation is far more complicated because public resources are limited, and the regulatory systems such as electronic monitoring are very costly. So funding for these punitive measures could reduce the resources available for victim services. So some women's rights activists expressed reservations or skepticism about these policies, pointing out that while the government made bold gestures of being tough on crime, it often failed to allocate sufficient resources for victim support and protection services. So this ongoing tension between punitive measures and victim-centered support became the key point of debate during this period. Okay, let's move on to some current issues. So as we have seen, policy efforts in the 2000s mainly focused on regulating sex offenders who are deemed abnormal. And these policies were often disconnected from broader gender issues. But from the mid-2010s, feminist activism gained new momentum, especially through digital platforms. So young women in their 20s and 30s began to use social media and other online platforms to rally around feminist causes. So especially digital activism played a crucial role in tackling new forms of gender-based violence, such as digital sexual violence or misogyny in the digital space. And this, so digital sexual violence emerged as a major social issue in Korea in the mid-2010s. So one of the earliest examples was spy cam videos, where women were filmed without their knowledge or consent. And another issue was the so-called revenge pornography, or the distribution of intimate sexual videos without consent. So these videos and spy cam videos had been circulated and consumed as a form of pornography since the early 2010s. So at that time, the laws already banned such videos, but enforcement was very weak. So law enforcement agencies were often reluctant to intervene, saying that it was extremely difficult to trace the anonymous sources of online videos. So while the government didn't take the issue seriously, young women's groups stepped in. So they began monitoring websites where illegal sexual contents were circulated, such as Soranet. Have you heard of Soranet? Soranet was the most notorious online platform. Soranet is the name of the website. So it's an online platform where sexual exploitation materials were shared and misogyny was rampant, with the users encouraging each other to commit rape and other sexual violence. So young women's group, such as Revenge Pornography Out, founded in 2015, started to tackle the issue by documenting illegal posts on Soranet and reporting them to the police. And they also organized petition drives to shut down Soranet. So their efforts succeeded, and Soranet was shut down after 17 years of operation. But this didn't solve the issue entirely. Similar illegal websites quickly popped up, and non-consensual sexual materials continue to proliferate online. So this is a big issue in Korea right now. So after the shutdown of Soranet, young feminist groups expanded their efforts to stop digital sexual violence on a larger scale. So Revenge Pornography Out changed its name to Digital Sexual Crimes Out. So the name change was intended to emphasize the criminal nature of such materials, saying that non-consensual recordings are not pornography, but crimes of sexual exploitation. And other non-profit organizations emerged to tackle digital sexual violence, such as Korea Cyber Sexual Violence Response Center and Project Reset, for reporting sexual exploitation in Telegram. So these groups worked to identify websites where illegal sexual contents were shared and report them to the police and assist victims in removing their videos from online platforms. Okay. So during this time, several high-profile cases occurred in South Korea. The most notorious one was the Burning Sun scandal in 2019, so just in case. So this case is the investigation into Burning Sun nightclub case revealed that popular K-pop singers had drugged the women and raped them and filmed the rapes and shared the videos in group chat modes. And another major instance in the same year was the Anthem case, which is a larger scale online sexual exploitation through Telegram. So in this case, many women and adolescents were forced into filming sexually exploitative videos, and the known victims numbered in the dozens, and thousands of people watched the video. So this sparked a widespread outcry, and millions of people signed petitions demanding thorough investigations and harsh punishments for the main operators and the public disclosure of the identities of all users involved. So in response to this, the investigations into the Anthem case progressed rapidly, and the main operator was arrested and sentenced to 42 years in sentence for producing and distributing child sexual exploitation materials. So this 42-year sentence was unprecedented in its severity. So previously there were criticisms that the judiciary was too lenient in online sexual violence cases, but in the Anthem case, the court responded to public pressure by imposing a harsher sentence, which recognized the seriousness of the crime. And the activism of young feminist groups was crucial. They brought the Anthem and similar cases to public attention, highlighting the rights violations involved in the production and distribution of such materials. And their activities also contributed to the investigation and prosecution of some website operators. But however, there's always however. There's persistent challenges of social stigma for victim blaming. So the movement to stop digital sexual violence is still ongoing, calling for continued efforts to change social attitudes and better protect victims. So let's move on to another current issue, which is gender-based violence in intimate relationships. So this issue overlaps with digital sexual violence to some extent. So as you can see from the term revenge pornography, it often involves recording and distribution of sexual images from intimate relationships without consent. So in this sense, digital sexual violence can be a form of gender-based violence in intimate relationships, but intimate violence goes beyond sexual violence. So it includes domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. So violence in intimate relationships is particularly destructive because it's often sustained and repetitive and poses a higher risk of retaliation from the perpetrator if the victim tries to leave the relationships. So because of this, without immediate intervention and effective measures to prevent further violence, it can be hard for victims to leave the relationship. And this challenge is clearly evident when looking at domestic violence policies. So although South Korea enacted domestic violence laws in the 1990s, there are still gaps in the implementation of these laws. So for example, the laws included victim protection measures such as restraining orders or separation orders. So specifically, courts can order the perpetrator to leave the victim's residence or prohibit them from approaching within 100 meters of victim's home or workplace. But there was a continued criticism that these protection measures were not effective. So even when the perpetrator was ordered to stay away from the victim, these orders often failed to prevent further violence. So the major issue was that these protection orders, so there was no guarantee that the perpetrator would comply with these orders. So in response to these challenges, several amendments have been made. So for example, one amendment allowed for the detention of perpetrators in police stations or detention centers when the perpetrator violated the protection orders. And later amendments strengthened the victim protection system, allowing for victims to request protection orders directly from the courts, and strengthened the legal penalties for violating protection orders, including a sentence of imprisonment. So despite these developments, another significant issue is that these protection measures are limited to restraining orders or eviction, something like that. So if you think about economic gender inequality, one of the major obstacles for domestic violence victims trying to leave the relationship is economic dependence. So if the victim lacks the financial means to support herself, it can be hard for her to leave the abuser and escape the abusive situation. So there's an argument that protection measures should include not only violence prevention, but also economic support to help victims to gain financial independence and thereby facilitating their escape from abusive situations. Another challenge is the leniency of penalties for perpetrators. So this issue is closely related to the stated purpose of the laws. So if you look at the purpose of the Act, it emphasizes maintaining healthy families. So although it mentions the human rights of victims, the law still puts more emphasis on the preservation of the family. So this means that domestic violence policies largely revolve around the goal of maintaining the family unit. So, and because of this, the laws created a special procedure for criminal punishment, which is basically offering diversion programs for perpetrators, such as counseling or violence prevention education or probation instead of criminal punishment. So they are exempted from criminal punishment. So there has been a strong call for policy changes to ensure that the perpetrators are held criminally responsible and to prioritize victim protection over the preservation of the family. But, however, this issue requires careful consideration because while harsher penalties may seem necessary, there is a concern that stricter punishments could, in reality, discourage victims from contacting law enforcement because many victims express that their priority is to stop the violence, not necessarily to see their partners punished. So, and this is especially true when the abuser is the family's primary financial provider. So if you think about it, their imprisonment could make worse the victim and their family's economic situation worse. So, and some victims might fear the risk of retaliation from the perpetrator after strict punishment. So while holding perpetrators legally accountable is important, the challenge lies in finding a balanced approach. Let's skip one issue, the dating violence. So let's move on to the last issue. The legal definition of rape is one of the most significant legal debate issues in Korea today. So currently, legal judgment of rape requires the use of force or evidence of physical assault or intimidation. So while the judicial interpretations of this requirement has become more flexible, this legal definition remains problematic in many ways. So, and more recently, the Me Too movement provoked debates on this issue. As many of you may know, the Me Too movement began in the United States, where victims or survivors of sexual violence publicly share their stories. And in South Korea, the movement started in 2018, where survivors spoke out about sexual violence committed by prominent politicians and cultural figures, which had a profound impact on Korean society. And one of the major impacts of the high-profile Me Too cases was the renewed discussions on the legal definition of rape. So this is a long-standing issue, and the current debate centers on establishing the absence of consent as the defining element of rape. So in recent years, several bills were introduced to the National Assembly to criminalize non-consensual sexual acts. So these bills followed two approaches. So the first one suggests adding a new crime specifically for sexual intercourse without consent. And the second one proposes removing the current existing requirement of violence or intimidation and replacing it with consent-based definition of rape. So the intent of these bills is to ensure that any sexual act against one's will or without consent can be prosecuted and punished as rape, regardless of the use of force. So this is a divisive issue. So some experts oppose this move. The critics raised concern that consent in intimate settings can often be implicit rather than explicitly stated. And this could lead to misunderstandings or make it difficult to prove in court. And critics argue that this could result in courts relying on arbitrary interpretations of implicit and ambiguous signals of consent. So on the other hand, proponents argue that these concerns can be addressed through carefully crafted legislation with clear legal standards for determining consent. And proponents emphasize that rape law should protect sexual autonomy by covering various forms of coercive sexual acts that have gone unpunished under the current system. Also, proponents point out that adopting a consent-based definition aligns with international standards. So, for example, the United Nations recommendations state that sexual violence should be defined based on the absence of freely given consent. And in fact, some countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, and Germany already adopted consent as a key element in judging rape cases. So, as of now, the proposed bills in South Korea have not yet been passed into law, and the debate is ongoing. So to conclude, let me summarize some key points. First, since the 1990s, there have been significant policy developments addressing broader range of gender-based violence. So various forms of violence that were previously overlooked are now recognized and included under criminal law, such as domestic violence, marital rape, digital sexual exploitation, and stalking. So this shift aligns with the United Nations recommendations for criminal justice principles, which emphasize that when the system is too lenient on gender-based violence, it perpetuates gender inequality and may even encourage such violence. So ensuring criminal accountability is crucial for enhancing the victim safety and empowerment, and sending a clear message that such violence will not be tolerated. And second, there's been a growing emphasis on victim protection alongside criminal punishment. So traditionally, criminal law focused mainly on punishing offenders and paying little attention to victims' needs, but gender-based violence has distinct features in that it stems from gender inequality, and a high proportion of incidents occur in intimate settings. So because of this, many victims often face repeated violence over time and secondary victimization, such as victim blaming. So this means that simply punishing offenders is not always enough to stop the violence or help victims recover. So policies have been adopted to protect victims from further violence and to ensure their access to justice. So in this regard, progress has been made, but more efforts are still needed. And lastly, these changes did not happen in isolation. So most policy developments were triggered by extreme cases, which prompted advocacy efforts from women's organizations, leading to increased public demand for legislative action. So the development of laws and policies addressing gender-based violence has been largely driven by the women's movement and feminist thought. Okay, with that, I conclude my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So if you have any questions, please raise your hand, and then the Dr. Yu will point you out, and then just press the button on your desk. There's a microphone on each desk.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I want to ask if women's organizations that have been clearly important in the process of policy changes have faced any intimidation from the government or from other structures maybe. Have they been punished for being too active for advocating for women's rights?
I'm sorry, I don't think I understood your question. Can you repeat that?
So women's organizations that have been fighting for women's rights and have been catalysts for these policy reforms, have they been in some form intimidated or punished by the government? Because unfortunately, sometimes it is the case here that women's organizations usually face more issues.
Okay, so so you're talking about kind of backlash, right? Yes. Yes. So as I mentioned, in the 1990s, and also in the Me Too movement, so for example, women started to publicly speaking out about sexual violence, and one of the methods they used was the exposure of the perpetrators. And backlash was that they were sued. So I don't know if you have the law against defamation. Defamation, do you have the law in Kazakhstan? Yes, so defamation laws were applied. So the accused perpetrators of sexual violence, they sued the victims for the defamation. So that's one of the backlash. And I don't think that the government actively suppress the women's movement, but yes, the defamation law was one of the major challenge in women's movement.
Okay. In terms of digital violence, what do you think about the way this, appearance of AI or with deepfake ones that are now very problematic in terms of law regulations? What would be your opinion on regulating?
On regulating deepfake crimes? It's a hard one. Okay. So there's a discussion. Okay, it's a very developing issue. So it's a very current issue. And there's a discussion in Korea that penalties for using AI to make explicit materials should be increased. But I don't think that would be very effective because it's too pervasive. So the government cannot punish all the offenders. And in my opinion, the court would be very lenient on the offenders because, first of all, most of the offenders were minors in this issue. So like over 70 or 80% were minors. So So stronger punishment will not be very effective in my opinion. So rather, education will be important. So if you think about school bullying, it was a very intense issue like 2 decades ago. And strong efforts to educate students on this issue of school bullying, and it was very effective. So in actuality, the school bullying is very much solved in South Korea. So in this case of deepfake crimes, I think the offenders, who are, most of them are minors, they committed the crimes, in my opinion, without very consciousness of their criminality. So in this case, I think education is very crucial. And also regulations on the online service providers is crucial. So I think you have already known about this issue. Telegram has escaped regulations so far, but recently the CEO of Telegram was arrested, and they changed their attitudes, so they started to adopt policies to regulate their content. So this will be effective to some extent, and stronger regulations on the service providers will be needed.
Yes, thank you for your wonderful presentation. Just following on that part about education is that, okay, so you have actually explained like this legal policies of, criminal laws against this violence against gender-based violence, but then is there kind of like more positive laws development on like how to actually enhance the education or the perception on gender issues in Korea?
These laws, all of these include education efforts. So these laws include the requirement for organizations like public institutions like schools or employers to do education on gender-based violence. So it's a requirement in South Korea now.
One more question. This school also had this kind of gender-based violence, and that this school recently actually established this anti-harassment committee by in this school, and I was now I kind of think of it like even during my time in college, like this what should I say, reporting this kind of problems through poster was actually very prevalent, and but I'm also pretty sure that the higher ups in the universities did not want these kind of issues to be publicized too much. So probably in that case, like school also had this kind of, what should I say, kind of push to actually make this problem small, but still it actually flourished in Korea, right? So how was it possible in Korea that even despite the, what should I say, not hard, but somewhat mild repression by the higher ups in the universities, how those university-based movements actually flourished?
What do you think? What do you think? But students were steadfast. Yeah, that's one of their causes.
Yeah, I mean, like for us, I think like, I mean, there are some roles that our faculties like us can actually kind of take, but still, it's really difficult to actually be, we can't. I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't know why, how like they were like very steadfast, despite the things that they could actually kind of face in the future. But it's just that, you know, I mean, I don't know as well, so that's why I kind of asked for how people are operating now. Like, you know, it is a problem. It is a problem. Everyone knows it's a problem, but it's not. I think it's not getting the momentum. But just to compare, like, how did this thing happen? Like in Korea, like it actually got some momentum, and just knowing how what it was, what it actually kind of brought that momentum would actually kind of be like kind of like a push factor in other parts of the world as well.
So the student movement in South Korea in late 1990s, it was just after the women's organizations movement against the sexual violence. So it was a big issue in the whole society, and there was a strong tradition of students' movement back then. So, and also, I think what was important, crucial, was the organized efforts among students. So the students, they didn't just respond individually, they organized student organizations, and there was a strong solidarity efforts among these organizations. So I think that's one of the...
I have one some question. So you know, so Korea societies have a big improvement in the women rights, and then the gender-based criminal actually is maybe not enough. You know? But sometimes male side criticize extreme feminist movement, and then sometimes false accusation issues. So because when the sexual crime, woman argues, then the responsibility totally to the male, for example, of offender. He's innocent, he did it. So some girls or ladies side use this kind of the things, so they make some false accusation, and this can be a big issue also, because some cases realized, and then in the case male, the false accused, the persons lose everything because of these issues. So how can you make some balance? We need to improve the woman's right, but also men's right is important. Innocent people's, false accused, then he lost everything. How do you
This
think about it?
question relates back to the issue raised by the first question, the backlash.
Mm-hmm.
So I forgot to mention this issue. The false accusation was punished in Korea. So, some women who raised the issue of sexual violence could face the risk of defamation, punishment for defamation, and punishment for false accusation. So this issue, well, it's a controversial issue. So, but in my opinion, the balance has not been achieved. So protection for victims is still more needed than protection for the rights of the accused. So well, I think it depends on the opinion as stands.
Can you hear me?
collect the Istanbul Convention. Istanbul Convention. South Korea didn't sign this convention, and as far as I know, you show us some level changes, and I believe that South Korea had all passed towards this combat against domestic violence. So, while in Kazakhstan right now we are trying to sign, and like in our past to sign this convention in the future. So I just want to know your opinion about the Istanbul Convention, like, because I heard that some laws of South Korea didn't align with the aims of this Istanbul Convention that was signed by European Union countries. And that's my question.
Could you repeat?
Istanbul Convention is like a convention.
Istanbul Convention?
Yeah. And Kazakhstan government is trying to sign this convention in the future, like has some plans, and we are moving towards this goal in the future. While as far as South Korea is not a member of this convention, and this country, your country, implemented its own legal framework, and as it showed us, some of them are already effective in the future, like in terms of feminist activism and so on. So, if you've heard anything about like criticism of Istanbul Convention, like why South Korea didn't join this convention? And, because I heard that some ideas of this implementation to legal framework of South Korea didn't align with the idea of this convention.
I don't have a detailed answer for that right now. But do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't have, but when I was intern with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, we just invited this European Union Council, and then we discussed this matter of like how Kazakhstan can enhance its actions against domestic violence. And I don't know why, but like Western approach, I don't like too much Western approach, and it was interesting to hear how South Korea implements these legal changes, because I believe that we are mostly influenced by Western powers, and I believe that Singapore's experience and South Korea's experience is also interesting to hear and to learn something. So that's my opinion. But I believe Kazakhstan government should interact with other countries too. Like in the future, I believe so.
That's a important question, but I'm sorry, but I don't have a detailed answer.
It's actually a convention done by Council of Europe, so it's actually more European-based international convention, so that as long as a country is a member of CEDAW, which is a convention of the rights of women, then we actually kind of that actually is kind of like a big, more international thing, to be exact, and as long as I know, is actually more European countries. Most of them are European countries that actually joined this Istanbul Convention. So, and the basic thing about the international law is that if you already have like domestic law equivalent to such international law, then it's not quite mandatory to actually join. Yes, so that's part of what I mean.
So, to begin with, I want to thank you for your presentation. It was very insightful. And my question will be regarding the working environment, because so far we covered the university part and the domestic violence. But do you have special legal laws in regards with working environment? Because even in work, female most of the time face difficulties, etc.
Yes. Here, so in 2009 Framework Act on Gender Equality. So this law covers gender equality issues and sexual harassment prevention efforts in the workplace. So, but as I said, these efforts were are not related to criminal procedures. So it's more like a requirement for employers to implement efforts to create the environment more gender friendly and prevent sexual harassment, something like that. So yeah.
And do you have like any motivation in working environment to people who face any kind of harassment, sexual harassment or violence to come out? Because sometimes it's very hard to do.
So what was the question?
Do you have some kind of motivations? Because on the university level, like there were people like with huge papers, etc. They were actually publicly exposing the perpetrators, but on the working environment. Is there something similar going on?
Yes. Do you have any thoughts on that? Yes, this is another issue, completely another issue from the sexual crimes. The sexual harassment is very prevalent, but it's not punished crimes. So it should be resolved through alternative systems, something like committees or what is it called? Like something like complaint system, you know. So and the implementation of effective of such systems is very difficult. So there are many issues, and I couldn't cover this issue in here, but thank you.
So again, thank you all for the presentation. Again, yeah, it was quite interesting also in Korea. Me myself, I am a second year PSR student, political science student, and I'm also quite interested in GBV because I'm also a club member of one of the club members who raises awareness about the gender-based violence and gender inequality, and also I'm a part of the community that one of the professors mentioned, anti-harassment community that we initiated in our university. So basically, I don't have like one particular question. I just wanted to maybe like open some kind of discussion, maybe just like share our own like personal university experience, how we're like solving this issue. So basically, we started this campaign like last year, and it was like quite effective because it's like our first experience in like advocating about like harassment and violence and how to prevent all of this. So we conducted a lot of like info sessions during the lectures. So like we basically as a team went to lectures like just like at the beginning we were like talking about what is consent, what is harassment, what is considered as harassment, etc. So but like overall, yes, I think as you said before, it's maybe the students' perception and stereotypes about the harassment and overall violence, because mostly the listeners who were actually very active and attentive during such lectures were girls rather than boys, to be honest. There were quite a lot of like kind of comments or some jokes during the lectures, like, haha, isn't it like girls stuff, or I don't know, why are you talking about some personal stuff which is not really connected with the lecture itself, and etc. So really, our team does not only consist of girls but also boys, and we really don't know how to kind of like cultivate this kind of like I don't know, mindset in people that you can also become a victim or a person bystander who can actually see this kind of crime or violence going on, and you can actually also contribute to solving it. Okay, so this is basically what we do. And in committee, for instance, recently we had our like gathering, and there we discussed as a university how we can teach, like as you said, education. So how can we educate the students about the GBV, right? So there were two ways. The first way is to integrate in the course curriculum a mandatory course that every student should take during their first year. So they are entered in university, so we have an orientation week where students are kind of like getting introduced to the university, etc. So we are also planning on this like curriculum, like writing the whole like syllabus, etc. on how you should like take this course, etc. how to succeed in it. So yeah, it's on planning and probably will launch like on next fall semester, so next year. Another suggestion was to buy some kind of like subscription to an app, application, mobile application. You know, it's also its CEOs are also based in Jerusalem. So I'm kind of like also skeptical about that. It's the only kind of like app that we actually knew who are kind of like raising awareness about GBV and also self-protection. So we contacted them and they offered us like some kind of like subscription. You can like make students download this app so that they could also take this kind of course and try to learn how to maybe self-defense during the violent cases, or like how to maybe understand if it's consensual thing or not. But the problem is that no one will download this app, like on their will, right? Because it's not mandatory. No one will kind of like check like if you downloaded it or not. It's not kind of like mandatory. You cannot force students to do it. So yeah. So the thing is that I think our society, community overall is not really ready to kind of like be, as you said, steadfast about this whole issue. We have some activists who are really willing to do all they can to like raise awareness and fight for the rights of women and any gender, especially like we don't only like consider only women's rights, right? So this thing, and I also kind of like thought, was this kind of like movement only maybe centered in one city in Korea, or it was like kind of widespread? You know, not only in Seoul, maybe it was kind of popular in Seoul universities, but also maybe in other. Was it like really big, right?
Yeah.
Because, for instance, in Kazakhstan, we are the first university who are actually thought about opening this kind of committee, and we are the first ones who initiated like the whole conversation about gender-based violence and harassment. So I think that other universities, first of all, are not even ready to kind of like open clubs and kind of like treat these students who are activists as like serious people. They think that it's all like, you know, Western kind of stuff and very unserious, and they're maybe, I don't know, yeah, kind of like maybe even crazy, you know. And yeah, so we really hope that after some years, after some work, and we are also currently on negotiations with other student clubs, not necessarily who are in gender equality sphere, but you know, like maybe political science students as well, maybe law students. So there are some kind of these clubs, and we are trying to engage with them and do some common events, you know, not only based on our university, but maybe we go to their universities and we conduct lectures, we conduct some kind of like discussions, open panel sessions with the students. So yeah, this is basically our like experience as activists and students who are like trying to enforce this whole like narrative about like against the violence and harassment. So yeah, yeah. So do you think that it will be plausible maybe like in 5-10 years to kind of like do this? I don't know. So in this kind of like place.
Thank you for sharing your stories. Okay. Well, it takes time, really.
Yeah.
It takes maybe a decade or 2 decades, and we went through that. Mm-hmm. So, well, I was there in the late 1990s universities, and so in the student movement against sexual violence, and that was the beginning of the movement. And I think it takes, I don't know how many years. It took a decade, more than a decade, to the student movement against sexual violence.
Still ongoing.
Yeah, yes, it's still ongoing. So, in my presentation, I talked about the implementation of the procedures, but it could be achieved quite rapidly. But what is more problematic was cultural atmosphere and cultural values, and of course it takes more time to change cultural values. Yeah, so it's still ongoing, but I think we have achieved quite progress, but it was very gradual process. So, yeah.
One last question.
So, okay. So I think what is important is to not be afraid of making things uncomfortable.
So Korea seems to have like much stricter rules against like sexual violence rather than Pakistan. So according to this, are there lots of cases when like offenders in Korea have not been punished for their crimes?
So your question is?
So yeah, are there a lot of cases when like offenders?
Not punished?
Yeah.
Yes. Lots of cases.
Burning some cases.
Yeah, burning cases. And in domestic cases, in domestic violence cases, the proportion of the punished case is very low, extremely low, less than like 5%.
So like, what can stop people to like stop like offending, or even if law cannot help?
It's a very hard question. So it requires a comprehensive approaches, so like cultural changes and education and prevention efforts from the community, and not just from the law, from the communities and the families, because victims of domestic violence are often faced with pressure from their families or communities to keep silence. So it requires a wide range of efforts.
Okay, so this ends today's lecture and seminar. Thank you everyone for your questions and interactions with our guest speaker. So please give her a last big applause for the speaker. Thank you.